I'm Leslie Schwartz, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Leslie Schwartz.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are handy links over in the sidebar on the right-hand side where you can subscribe to the show. You can find all of the archives in a handy little drop-down list, or there's a search bar where you can search for your favorite author and see if they have been on the show in these past more than 400 episodes. Thank you to our sponsors for allowing us to do this. And we've got some new sponsors coming on. Daniel Kinney, my favorite middle grade author, is just doing amazing things right now. He is publishing like a madman, but he's putting out excellent books. I buy his books for my nieces and nephews all the time. My kids are a little older now, but my nieces and nephews, I buy Daniel's books and put them in their hands. They are top shelf quality and really fun books. There's a link to Daniel's Amazon page in the show notes, and we're going to be highlighting more of his books as we go on this month. But go visit Daniel Kinney and buy his books for your favorite kids, and they will love it. Roy M. Griffiths has a new book, Bringing the Fire, The Lonesome George Chronicles, Book 2. Roy is really doing some amazing stuff in speculative fiction, and we're going to be highlighting more of those as the month goes on. But go pick up Roy's newest books. There's a link to it in the show notes. If you're a fan of alternative history or war and military thrillers, you're going to love these books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, thanks to my buddies Nick and Jason from Galaxy's Edge for sponsoring the show. I would like to welcome back as a sponsor to the show, Nick Breaker and his fantastic series, Essence. Book 1, Septima, and Book 2, Alta, are out now. Nick is feverishly working to release Book 3 now. It's in editing, and you are going to absolutely love this series. Troy, with his irrational fears, is the least likely person to lead a war, but that doesn't mean he can escape his destiny. This fantastic science fiction action series is full of great characters, great character development, lots of action, and lots of weird science fiction goodness. If you love a great character-driven story with great science fiction, you are going to love this series. Essence. 2 books are out now. Book 1, Essence. Book 2, Alta. And the 3rd book will be here soon. Get into this series now. Everyone's talking about it. Thank you, Nick Breaker. Thanks for tuning in. As always, at the end of the show, we have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Leslie Schwartz on the show with me today. Leslie is the author of a brand new book called The Lost Chapters, Reclaiming My Life One Book at a Time. And this book is tremendous. Y'all, I can't wait for you to get a copy of it. Leslie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Leslie, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Wow. I actually wrote, I knew what novels were pretty much at the age of 5 or 6, I was writing, and I wrote a novel at that age. It was about my dog. Her name was Bubala, and it was about 6 pages long, and I had taped the binding together, and it was really just a description of my dog. And there were some artifacts that I taped in the book, like her little baby teeth. I had taped those in there, and I think I snipped some of her hair. And so that was and I taped all of that in there. And so that was the first time I wrote something, and my memory of that is that no one told me to do that. You know what I mean? It just was something I did.
Right. And by adding all of the stuff to it, you wanted to make sure the reader had a really visceral experience with this novel.
Yeah, completely. And my beloved dog, I mean, she was adorable. So, absolutely.
That is so cool. So cool. Were you a big reader as a kid?
I was. I read all the time. I spent a lot of time in my room. I had a little rocking chair in there, and I would just read all the time, anytime I had a chance. And I remember all summer long, I loved to swim and play outside, but summers, for some reason, I liked to sit in the cool room and just read, one book after another in that little rocking chair.
What kinds of things did you, what were some of the first stories that really captured your imagination?
Well, I remember, of course, Little Women. And I read possibly all the Nancy Drew books. And then I remember things like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and, just like those kinds of books. They just, whatever came to me. My mom took us to the library every other week. And so we got to pick out books. I mean, she'd been doing that since I was a little kid, tiny, before I really started reading. And I remember that being such an amazing experience. And I would just pick whatever I could. I got to have 3 books, and I would get them home and lay them out on my bed, and I would look at the covers of the books, and then I would just read, and then 2 weeks later we would return them, and I would do that all over again. And it was such a gift. I couldn't believe that you could actually go to a place and borrow books and then bring them back. To me, it's still a miraculous idea.
Absolutely. And I'm like you. I like that whole experience, holding the book and checking out all the cover art and reading all of the stuff that everyone else skips over. All of that stuff makes, books are magical, and the whole experience. I love it all.
I love when I get a new book and I open it up and that smell, that smell I'm talking
yes,
about?
I know
it's
exactly.
So great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
And hardbacks smell different from paperbacks, and
they do. And used books versus new books. I mean, it's the whole thing.
Right.
It's really my love. Books are my love.
And Kindles just smell like the last thing you ate, whatever was on your fingers at the time.
I don't even use one. I don't read online at all. So I don't read that way. So I haven't even had that experience ever. I've never done it. Yeah.
So you're this book lover kid, and did a teacher or parent ever recognize the gift in you and encourage you?
I did have a teacher in third grade, and then again in high school, I had an AP teacher, AP English teacher. I remember I think it was third grade. We did a journalism class, or maybe it was seventh grade. Yeah, Mrs. Cappy, and yes, she saw something in me and really encouraged me. And it was in a journalism class. And then later, I wrote poetry, and I'm going to say really, really bad adolescent melodramatic poetry in high school. And we had some kind of publication in high school, so I got my poems. Miss Antipas was the teacher, and she helped me. Oh, no, it was Miss Janowski, sorry. And she really encouraged me to publish these poems, which I won't even look at now. But
it's almost a rite of passage to write some of those self-indulgent, narcissistic, poems.
Oh God, absolutely, and they're so cringeworthy. But the thing that was so interesting is that my girlfriends in high school, I had a big group of girlfriends. They loved it, and they wished they could write like that, and they wanted more poems. Can you write me a poem about death or something? And I would do this, and share it with them, and they loved it too. So I think you're right. It was age appropriate for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
What did you go to college for, and what did you? What sort of career did you set out on? A lot of times people know they want to be a writer and know they want to pursue that path, but you have to pay bills and all of that stuff, and writing comes back around. But what was your path like?
Well, I went to UC Berkeley. My undergrad was at UC Berkeley, and I majored in rhetoric with a minor in English. So obviously that was not a career path, major.
Rhetoric. Huh?
I just wanted to, I wanted to read. I wanted to read the canon, of literature, which you do in rhetoric and in English. But in rhetoric, it's a whole different way of looking at literature and a whole different way of writing about it. So in so many ways, that the courses I took in rhetoric prepared me so much for writing. They taught me really how to look at every aspect of the whatever I was reading, the book. Who's the narrator? Who's the implied narrator? Is it omniscient? I mean, I learned about point of view, early. I understood about point of view, which is something I think new writers, it's tricky for new writers. And it was something that I think intuitively I understood, but I know that through the rhetorical analysis that I, did on these books, I learned a great deal about writing. But I can assure you that there was no career path to follow after graduation. And I just wanted to write. And that's all I wanted to do. So I took jobs that paid my rent and, office jobs. And then I just started publishing short stories, which, you don't get paid for. But I didn't really care what I was doing in a job as long as I had time to write and I could pay my bills.
That's a weird thing about writers is that when you're bitten by the bug, you'll do it whether you ever make any money at it, whether anybody reads it, it's just going to be a thing. And I had fantasy author Brandon Sanderson on the show one time, and he said that he had written like 13 novels before he got one published, and he said the honest truth is that I would just write novels and I would just stick them in my closet if they never got published, because that's who I am. That's what I'm going to do. And whether someone buys it or not, obviously I would love for them to, but whether they do or not, doesn't determine whether I'm going to write or not. And not many other things have that kind of draw and pull on a person to keep going in the face of rejection.
I honestly think that it's genetic or something, because the drive, if you have it, it's not even like you've been bit by the bug. I feel like it's that you have this drive, and it's unstoppable in that really deep biology way, you know, in our soul or whatever. And so I think that I think writers are really willing to put up with a lot of disappointment and suffering just for the sake of being able to write, you know?
Absolutely. So you started writing short stories. Did you get any traction writing short stories?
I got a little bit. There were some, I remember one time there was an agent from New York had read one of my stories and was interested, but at the time I just didn't have that. This was probably in the early 90s. I didn't have anything. So I was working, I had just moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and I was working at I was working for these real estate developers way up in above Malibu. It was beautiful. And I had a lot of free time there, and so I started to write a short story. And whenever any of them would walk by me at my desk, I would just switch screens, you know, because we had computers, and I would just switch the screen, and then they would walk by, and I would go back to doing what I was doing. And the short story became got longer and longer and longer, and it eventually became my first long-form narrative, a novel, and then that was my first book, and it was published by Simon & Schuster. So that I had a pretty good. It happened fast for me. I was lucky.
Yeah. And what was that first novel? Was that Jumping the Green?
Yeah, that's Jumping the Green. And I'll tell you that the reason I was that moved so quickly is that I had submitted it for this contest, the James Jones Literary Society, for Best First Novel, I think is the title of the contest. And I had just submitted it, the first 50 pages, I think, and then you made you made a cut, and then they asked for the next 50 pages, and I won. And so winning that got me an agent, and then the agent, you know, made a deal for me. So it was just these circumstances that happened rather quickly for me, you know, to have something that I had sort of labored over be fairly quickly published.
Right. What was that story about, Jumping the Green?
So that was about a young woman who grew up in a kind of a crazy family, 5 brothers and sisters in the family, and her older sister, her beloved older sister, is murdered. And so, and she's an artist, and it's just it's sort of I tend to write about this all the time. It's just a story about how she spirals into just a bad place, you know, and has to kind of bottom out before she finds a way to reconcile herself with her grief. So it's a literary novel. It's a young novel, very young. It's the same thing as the poetry in high school. I barely can read it, you know. I mean, I think it's a great book. I really like it, and a lot of people like it. I get a lot of feedback for it. But again, as you mature as a writer, you change. And so I think I shouldn't say I would never, because I don't like to, because the minute I say never, then I end up doing it. But I can't imagine ever writing a book again in first person. I just, you know, that would be something that I would probably never do again.
You followed that book up with Angel's Crest, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
And that came out. And
that book got a lot of attention.
Yeah, that book did pretty well. That was another really quick situation. I've had these really strange situations, but I wrote that book. And the interesting thing about that book, so I don't know if I'm giving anything away, but in that book, it's about a child who goes missing. And I started writing that book, and then I found out I was pregnant. And I finished writing that book until I basically I finished it just before I gave birth to my daughter. And there was something so strange about writing about a missing kid who, is found later. I don't want to give it away, but it was almost as if like my own fears about being a mom, and being responsible for this fragile little life were being played out as I wrote this novel. And the thing that I also did about that novel was that I decided to tell it from sort of the Rashomon way, where there were 7 different narrators, each of whom were discussing or dealing with this small town tragedy, from their own perspective. So it's getting back to this concept of point of view and how do we tell stories, right? This idea that the story, the plot unfolds from the perspective of the person telling the story. And because in my mind it was such a complex story, I couldn't conceive of just having one narrator. So I created 7 different narrators, and it goes chapter by chapter in their points of view. And from each of their perspective, they talk about their own life and then what's going on, in the town. And I felt like that was the way that I was going to be able to tell the whole story, was through these different points of view.
After that book and it got a lot of attention, something happened to you that ultimately we get to read about in The Lost Chapters, your brand new book. But walk us through what happened with you.
Okay, so this is what the new book, the memoir, is about. I am an alcoholic and a drug addict, and I had a lot of time clean and sober, and then I relapsed. And that relapse sent me in a spiral, just a horrible, horrible spiral. And I ended up, it almost killed me. It didn't even last that long, but it was a little over a year, but it really almost killed me. My family, had to leave the house for a little while. They're back now. And I ended up, when I sort of came to and started cleaning up, I ended up being sentenced to county jail for DUI and other driving related. There was no accident. Nobody was hurt, but other driving related offenses, misdemeanors. And so that obviously impacted my writing career. There was a period of time where I couldn't write. And then I wrote about that. So that's my 3rd book, which is a memoir, which is a completely different genre for me.
Right. Well, tell us about the title. It's a really interesting title, The Lost Chapters, Reclaiming My Life One Book at a Time. What does that title mean?
Well, so it's so interesting that you are asking about the title, because that title that you're reading there is actually not the right title. It's not the correct title.
What is the correct title?
So they published the original title, that one. That's the original title.
Okay.
And the one that we came up with later, and I'm holding it in my hand, the galley, is called The Lost Chapters, Finding Recovery and Renewal One Book at a Time, rather than Reclaiming My Life. And I don't know how this happened. When they sent me the hard copy of it, and it arrived, and it had my original title, which, off the record, I actually really like better. But, and I was confused when I saw it. It took me a minute to actually realize that they had done the first print run with this wrong title, the wrong subtitle. Isn't that hilarious?
That is hilarious. And now that you mention that, and I'm just going to tell here, I got a galley of this book months ago, and it was an early galley, and it had the Reclaiming My Life. And now I have a hardcover of the book, And I've not even paid attention to this until you just mentioned this. But the dust jacket says "Reclaiming My Life," but the book is printed on the inside. When you look at it, it has the correct title. It says "Finding Recovery and Renewal." I didn't even notice that. That's hilarious.
Well, see, it's hilarious, and that's the thing. You know, I want to. Yeah, I mean, it's so amazing to me that happened, and it was kind of shocking at first, you know, and then I quickly realized that my whole book, right, is about mistakes that I made as a human being. And, you know, we get to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I wasn't upset about it. I mean, you know, at first I was upset about it because it's like, you know, this is 4 years worth of work, blah, 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 blah. But then I was like, it's just a book. And people make mistakes. And that's, you know, my reaction to it just reminded me of how the privilege of my experience with that relapse, and I actually think of the sort of privilege of having to go to jail. I mean, that sounds odd, but the things that I learned and the way that I learned to just be so accepting of the mistakes that people make, and, you know, and also just understanding that we have to understand what really matters in our lives, and, you know, what battles we're gonna fight, and that just wasn't going to be one of them.
Right. Well, and
for me,
I understand what you're saying about the privilege of going through this situation, and the privilege of hardship sometimes, because it definitely is a different outlook when you can see the bad and know that this is going to be a period of growth. This is going to be something that I can learn from. This is going to make me a better human being on the other side of it. And I think that's the difference in people that make it and people that don't, maybe, is just the ability to see that something good can come out of this.
Well, I agree with you. I will say that I didn't have that perspective in the beginning because I was newly sober, and I did all of it completely clean and sober. And trust me, that's not easy to do because the jails are full of drugs, and you can get them, you know, readily. So it was challenging, but, you know, I had my books that I was reading and that came in, which is The Lost Chapters is about as well. But I also, it really wasn't until I was able to look back. And I think that's often for some of us the choice that we get to make. You know, are we going to be self-pitying? Are we going to continue carrying our shame around with us? Or are we going to, you know, look at our experience as something that's so valuable, you know, not just for me, but for other people around me, you know, the service that I can provide now for other people who struggle with that very same thing. And trust me, it happens all the time for people who have the genetic predisposition to addiction. So jail is not an unknown thing for people like us. And so I get to have the opportunity to be of service to other people. You know, the things I saw inside opened my eyes to the sort of imbalances of our criminal justice system, to say the least. You know, there was just a lot of things that I just became a better person, you know. But I think I had to make the conscious choice, you know, to be that way rather than to carry it around on my back and mope around. And I think you're right. I think that's what allows people to thrive or others not to thrive.
So the Lost Chapters, we're talking about a stack of books that you had while you were in there, and the impact that these books had on you. And you kind of chronicle your journey with these books. What were some of the books, and why did these books impact you the way they did?
Well, when I found out that I could have 3 books a week, that was the saving grace for me, because as we talked about, you and I first started talking, books are everything to me. They're the most important things. Like, I will lend you my fine suede jacket, but I will not lend you any of my books. That's how I am about them. So that when I found out that I could have books, people could send them to me. It was like, whenever I got them, it was like my birthday every single time. I would see them from my jail cell sitting on the deputy's desk, and I would just, my excitement, it was like, I was like having a birthday all the time. So there was that aspect of it, and it really helped me. But it was what was so interesting about this collection of books that were sent by my husband and friends is that they were so strangely prescient. Like the books seemed to have a mind of their own, and they seemed to know exactly what I needed to be comforted with at exactly the right time. So these books would come along, and then I would be in a particular state of mind, and then I would read a book, and it would calm me or change me or give me courage. And it was just the strangest, experience. So it was, I don't know, I just thinking about it now, I just can't believe I was lucky enough to have that, those books.
I did an interview a while back with Rachel Jepps, who was the daughter of Warren Jepps, and had the FLDS cult that we saw on the news years ago, and she escaped.
Yeah.
And it was an extremely powerful story because she said at one point they had bought an old school, an abandoned school, and they kind of turned that into their compound. But they discovered there was a library in there, and it stayed locked, but she and one of her friends figured out how to get into the library, and she started picking up books, and some of them were just, kind of, benign romance books and stuff that we would maybe not give a second thought to, and other things.
Right.
But it was the very fact that through the power of story and that reading these books that she got to see a world outside of her own, and doing that, sneaking those books out and just reading all different kinds of stories gave her the courage to escape. And there's no more powerful story about what books can do to change lives. And that, along with your story, that this it's these collections of stories that seem so I don't know, just they're just books,
random.
You might say, just random.
They're kind of random.
They're kind of random, and they have this power of their own. It's crazy.
Well, when you were telling me the story of her story about sneaking them out, first of all, that's so radical. That's such a radical act of resistance, And then I started getting goosebumps because it really felt exactly like my experience, that I got to have this thing in a place where you really aren't encouraged to read, and they put limits on it, and you can't have hardbacks and all this stuff. And that the idea, as you say, about the empowering quality that story has. I mean, it is what we are. Story is the essence of our life. We describe everything from our trip to the grocery store, to the novel we write, whatever. We describe all of that through story. So it is really essential to our lives. And then when you get to find a book in a place that's forbidden, wow, that's incredible,
It is incredible. So you're in jail, and you are working through, and you're very honest and raw in this book. You just really lay it out there. There are no, as far as we can tell, the reader, there are no secrets left to tell. When did you decide to tell this story? Because it would have been very easy. If you had not read this book, I would never know that had happened to you, and millions of other people would never know that side of your story. But you chose to kind of lay it all bare and to tell the whole story. What was that process like for you of coming to grips with the reality of it and realizing that this was a story that you needed to tell?
Well, that's such an interesting question, because originally what I wanted to do was a detective story about those, because many of those days, that 414 days that I was in my relapse, were in blackouts, and I don't remember what happened. And so originally I wanted to do this thing where I was going to interview people in my life. I collected all my police reports, all my doctor's reports, all my rehab, because I had gone to so many rehabs to try, in 1 year, something like 7 rehabs to try to get clean again. And I collected all this evidence, right? And I started to write my story. And what was so interesting was that I was able to retrieve my story, but it was from the perspective of other people's stories about my story. So I realized that I would never really own my story in a way, because I couldn't remember it. So, but in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about these books, and I kept thinking about how I really wanted to write like a book review, like from behind bars book review. And so I kind of put that one aside. The first one, I had written an entire book, that other detective one, and then I did this. And this thing didn't take me very long at all. But to answer your question about how did I come to terms with telling all of these secrets? And I'm really glad you asked me that. Thank you for asking me that, because I think that I have a pretty healthy perspective about what addiction is. And I believe, and I've done some research and I know this for a fact, that we have those of us who have addiction are genetically predisposed. And when the gene is expressed in whatever situation, we can't stop drinking or using drugs. And so it's a disease, and it's something that we can't help. If we could stop, we would. I'm going to tell you, ask any drug addict or alcoholic out there if they want to be what they are, and they will say no. And so it's incomprehensible to people who don't have this genetic predisposition to understand why we can't stop. But we can't. And it's in my mind, there's some sort of spiritual or divine thing that goes on that allows us 1 second to say no and gets us on a journey of recovery. What that is, I don't understand, because really I shouldn't even be here. But the thing is that I carried, for a while there, I carried so much shame, because you're right. If you look at me, I'm a blonde-haired yoga girl, like lady with a family, and I drive a Jeep. You would never think ever. I have a master's degree, right? Like I have a 401k. Do you know what I'm saying? You would never think that about me. But the thing is that is the truth about me. And I carried this shame around. And when I decided, after I read Ruth Ozecki's book In Jail, A Tale for the Time Being, I decided to just drop the whole shame thing and tell the truth. Because, the idea that what's wrong with me is a moral issue is bunk. It's not true. What's wrong with me is that I'm sick. And unfortunately, that sickness is expressed in bad behavior. But you can't treat the behavior. That's not what's treatable. And you lock people up who actually need help in other ways. They actually need treatment. And so our culture has an opinion about us. Our culture has an idea about how depraved we are and indifferent. And, we are when we're in our cups. We are depraved and indifferent, but that's not who we are. And so I just felt very strongly, because I loved the books that I read and I loved literature, I also felt that I wasn't going to tell this in a halfway way, that I had to be honest about what happens to us and to really talk about the truth. most people wouldn't do that. And most people, have just would never talk about themselves as being an addict. But I think that if we get it out there and remove the stigma and talk about it in a way that addresses what this really is, we can put our resources not into supporting jails, but into supporting actual human beings who need help. And we can find a solution for people. So all of that cultural shame that was heaped upon me, all that stuff that comes from the outside, is the only thing that was going to keep me sick. So I think that telling the truth, is the only way to recover and to stay alive and to find joy in your life, and to own who you are in all the good and the bad. I don't have a problem with what happened to me. I don't have a problem with myself, because I've chosen to be honest about it, and I've chosen not to be ashamed of it. So, that's the long answer, but I do feel strongly that we have to start talking about this stuff. We have to tell the truth about everything, or it won't change.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The other recurring theme throughout the book is not only about the books that you're traveling this journey with and your story of recovery, but it's also the story of the people around you and people that you were interacting with. And you mentioned earlier that you came to a place where you could be of service to others. Could you talk a little bit about that and about how the interactions with others not only helped them, but helped you throughout being that way?
While I was in jail?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an interesting question too, because I was helpless in that place, and they spotted me from a mile away, the other people who are part of this revolving door justice that we have in this country. And, so I would really say that it was the inmates who have a harder life than I did and who've been in and out of jail who helped me. And I found that, I know that I did help a lot of people with their homework because I got into the jail school, and I helped a lot of people, I would listen to them with their writing because they all knew I was a writer. And I did help them afterwards when I was out and they were out. I helped them I helped people with money and a place to stay and things like that. But while I was there, I really am indebted to the women inside, the inmates, not the deputies, right, but the inmates, my fellow inmates, who so lovingly took care of me. It was, I don't know, like I kept being told you have to, don't make friends and make sure you blah, blah, blah. And, there's going to be racial stuff. And I didn't have that experience. And I'm not sure why, but that was not my experience. My experience really was that there was so much love in that place. And, there was some bad stuff that went on, of course, but my experience of it was that I was being taken care of wholly and completely by, the other inmates in a way that was surprising to me.
And what an amazing story. I can't recommend this book enough, the Lost Chapters. Leslie, if people are just discovering you and your story and your work, is there a place where they can connect with you online to, discover your back catalog or keep up with news of what's coming up next?
Yeah, sure. I have a website, which is www.leslieschwartz.com. And from there, you can link to my Twitter and my Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff. But there's a lot of good stuff on my website. There's a great book trailer on there right now that is really fantastic. So the website's probably a great way to start, and you can contact me through there as well.
Fantastic. Leslie, it's been a great joy to talk with you. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was 10 years old when I saw my first ghost. The year was 1770. My father was a barber. He kept a small shop at the Kuenhoven Inn, where the King's Road met the Old Loop. Our modest home lay to the north, between the inn and the hanging tree. A simple box of pine boards whitewashed with crushed oyster shell, one room with a spinning wheel for mother, a chair for father, and up a ladder of branches, a garret where my parents slept. I slept on the floor below, alongside my little brother, Hans, 5 years younger than I. Our floor sloped toward the Hudson, so that when Hans rolled over in his sleep, he often went on rolling and couldn't stop, collecting splinters and grievances. Yet on this particular night, he slept peacefully, and I was the fitful one. A mouse had taken shelter in our wall, fleeing the October chill. It scritched and scratched, nibbling a nest for itself. The sound thrilled me. I possessed a vivid mind, full of toadstools and bullfrogs and lightning storms, and so imagined a skeleton writhed in the wood. The bones of Anne Underhill, perhaps, murdered by Indians at Spook Rock. I'd heard that tale from my father, who reveled in the Dutch superstitions. He would gather us to fireside on winter nights and spin tales of the Heer of Dunderberg, that storm king who rattled our white windows, of the Lady of Raven Rock, who died in snowfall, pining for her lover, of trolls beneath the penny bridge and hobgoblins in the hanging tree. He'd filled my head with such dark romance that I lay waiting for Anne's little finger bones to drag me off to some bloody fate. I rather hoped she would. A cloud cleared the moon, and a square of light fell on my mother's spinning wheel. The sharp spindle glinted, and the wheel began to turn, without touch. A figure appeared before me, as through a mist, a grey head bent to the work. She fixed me with eyes black as open graves and whispered in a low, guttural hiss, "Spin, or you shall not eat." I cried out and fell to my pallet, arms over my head. Hans awoke, lost his balance, and rolled away, bleating with pain as he struck the Riverside wall. Father emerged above. "Agatha, what is wrong?" "There's a ghost, Papa. A ghost! Help me!" Hans laughed despite his bruises, and Mother moaned and ordered us to sleep. But Papa descended and took my hands, his blue eyes twinkling. "What did you see?" "An old woman. She said, 'Spin, or you shall not eat.'" "Oh!" He raised a candle beneath his chin. "You saw old Willow. She lived here long ago, when this was the home of Isaac Hart, our candle maker. Her husband was killed by savages. Hart took her in at the request of Lord Phillips, who paid a token sum for her upkeep. But Hart was greedy, and kept the money for himself. He never fed her unless she spun. So Willow spun and spun and spun, like a spider, year by year, growing old and blind and falling to waste. She died at that spinning wheel, fell over one day, and the spindle pierced her heart." Hans screamed and hid beneath the table. Mother appeared above. "Daniel Van Ripper, you are a fool!" I kissed Papa's fingers, for I loathed that spinning wheel. I'd be no toothless ghost, spinning and haunting little girls. I felt pity for such a spirit, and gratitude to have her example before me, steeling my resolve. Every night thereafter, I would leave a crust of bread for old Willow, and sleep with one eye open, in case she came to spin for me again.